Hello, I'm Martin Smyth. I'm a visiting scholar at the Institute for Advanced Computational Science at Stony Brook University. I'm also a visiting scientist at the United States National Geospatial-Intelligence Agency. This is paper 21, Information Processing on Social Media Networks as Emergent Collective Intelligence. I'd like to thank my co-authors, Cody, Buntain, Debra, Dwyer, Joseph Finn, Joshua Garland, Jason Jones, and Michael Egan, our program lead at NGA. The Visiting Scientist program is administered by Oak Ridge Institute for Science and Education. Our project is made possible by in-kind support from IACS. Our work looks to understand the dynamics of information processing on social media service platforms. Our research application domain of interest has been the emergence of mass mobilization political movements, particularly those directed against authoritarian governments. However, our model dynamics are agnostic as to a particular application domain. Rather, our model simply describes the mechanism by which a network of individuals computes the flow of information across itself. 2 years before he died, Stephen Hawking remarked that we are all now connected by the internet, like neurons in a giant brain. This calls to mind Ian Cousin's breakthrough paper from 2009, Collective Cognition in Animal Groups, in which he observed that important commonalities exist with the understanding of neuronal processes. Much could be learned by considering collective animal behavior in the framework of cognitive science. Now, arguably the first tool of cognitive science was the electroencephalograph. This is the first published electroencephalogram collected by Hans Berger. So what we need to do is we need to identify an analogous tool that will help us understand processes that are going on social media networks, particularly around mobilization movements, mobilization events. And so what we did was we used the Twitter API to collect Twitter sample stream data for Sudan during 2019. And so we collected Twitter sample volumes for hashtags al-Sudan in Arabic and also its English language cognates. And here's what those data look like. So the first thing that jumps out at you is a pronounced spike in activity corresponding to April 11, when the al-Bashir regime was overthrown. There's a period of heightened activity immediately beforehand, and there's some diffuse activity in the interval December through March of 2019. Now, we're all familiar with the term going viral. It was explored in particular in a conference paper by Sunrosen, Marlowe, and Lento in 2009, appropriately entitled Gesundheit, Modeling Contagion Through Facebook Newsfeed. And what Sun and his co-authors were interested in was the way in which Facebook users interacted with Facebook pages. Facebook pages are Facebook profiles, but for non-persons. So think of your favorite sports team, your favorite restaurant, your favorite work of literature, this kind of thing. And so what Sun and his co-authors observed is that diffusion of pages occurs when a user fans a page. This action is broadcast to their friends' news feeds. One or more of their friends sees the item and decides to become a fan as well. Without newsfeed diffusion, we might expect that pages acquire their fans at a roughly linear pace. However, since Facebook users are so active, actions such as page fanning are quickly propagated through the network. As a result, we see frequent spikes in page fanning, presumably driven by newsfeed. Now, what Sun and his co-authors are describing is the simplest of all possible contagion processes, the SI process. Users transition from state S, or susceptible, before they've seen a notification in their newsfeed. Then they observe the notification that one of their friends has found a particular page, and they become infected, meaning they may elect to fan that same page. Now you might say, wait a minute, we're trying to model a complex behavioral contagion process, and we may need something more than a simple contagion framework. Certainly, Dana Satola remarked that we need more than awareness to model complex behavioral contagion, and that's absolutely true, particularly for behaviors that are as risky as expressing your opposition to an authoritarian regime. However, for our purposes, we think that a simple contagion framework may be sufficient because it's been used before to model online behavior, and also because of the online disinhibition effect, which was recorded by Suler back in 2004, in which individuals behave in ways online in which they would otherwise be inhibited to do in their day-to-day lives. However, the simple SI contagion framework may not be sufficient to describe what's going on in our data. So we look to the next simplest contagion process model, the SIS model, in which individuals transition from susceptible state S to infected and then back to susceptible again. SIS contagion models are marked in their contagion prevalence time series by a characteristic sigmoid curve. After the initial sort of saturation of the contagion process, it tends to equilibrate to a kind of a background contagion prevalence level in the population, which is fairly stable. The process is governed by a canonical pair of ordinary differential equations, which are themselves informed by two parameters: beta, the contagion spreading rate parameter, and gamma, the reversion parameter, or what an SIR model, or susceptible, infected, recovered, or removed model might be the removal rate. For our purposes, we're going to stick with an SIS framework. Now, all of our contagion process modeling is conducted with the epidemics on networks, or EON, Python software module developed by Gish, Miller, and Simon. I also refer you to their excellent companion volume, Mathematics of Epidemics on Networks from Exact to Approximate Models. And so we find that by playing two competing or canceling contagions against one another, we begin to get contagion prevalence time series that start to look more like the data that we're observing. So that's encouraging. You'd also see the same thing with an SIR model, by the way. However, it looks like there's still something else going on in our data, and so we need to understand that better. So to do that, we model the time series with the log periodic power law singularity model. The LPPLS model was popularized in a paper by Sernet, Johansson, and Bush-O from 1996. It was a contemporaneous paper by Feigenbaum and Freund. And what those guys were doing was that they were using the LPPLS model to try to understand the behavioral processes going on in stock markets, especially stock markets experiencing a bubble. However, the model itself came from previous work in mechanical systems. But for our purposes, we're going to use this specification of the model from the paper by Filimoto and Sarnet in 2013. So let's take a quicker, deeper look at what that looks like. So there's a lot going on in this 7-parameter model, but really there are only two important things that are happening. So the first is the log periodicity, which is controlled by the cosine function, and then there's the power law expansion at the front end of the equation. And so there are 7 parameters, as I said, but there are only 3 that kind of really govern the structure of what the model looks like. And then we also need to consider network structure, right? Now, Santola and Macy tell us about complex contagions and the weakness of long ties, and they identify an influence of network structure on the propagation of contagion process across a network morphology. There's also an excellent paper by Ugender, Blackstrom, Caro, and Malou, who looked at the anatomy of the Facebook social graph and identified some characteristics of it that are particularly telling. And Lang and de Sterk also used a sampled network graph for propagation of their contagion process in their study of political revolutions. So for us, we know that our contagion process plays out on a network graph substrate. Our network graphs are not homogeneous, but rather exhibit a characteristic morphology. And the observed waveform in the time series may occur as the contagion process propagates across the characteristic morphology of the substrate graph. So we found that by manipulating that morphology deliberately, we could, in effect, sort of engineer contagion prevalence time series data that looked like our kind of captured real-world data. But then we thought, well, hang on, the observed data are a trace of aggregate system behavior over time. And that trace results from an unseen behavioral contagion as it propagates across the substrate graph. So maybe what we should be doing is modeling the unseen contagion process generating the data. And so to do that, we assume that idealized phenomena yield LPPLS signals in their behavioral contagion prevalence time series. So we retain the simple contagion framework, but we vary the spreading rate parameter beta in time as follows. So you can see what we do is we simply borrow the log periodicity from the log periodic power law model, and we use that to vary our contagion spreading rate parameter beta. And we take that contagion process and we propagate it on simple toroidal grid lattices. Now, what I like to call plain vanilla network graphs. And the reason we do that is because we're effectively embedding the effect of the network graph morphology within the contagion spreading rate parameter. So we want to make sure that as we propagate that now on a network graph, that we don't have any artifacts of network graph structure. So for that reason, we choose to propagate that on simple toroidal grid lattices. Now, George Box famously remarked that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Obviously, he was talking about statistical models, not computational simulation models. However, I'm going to borrow George Box's advice by deliberately, in this case, modeling a phenomenon in a way that we know is not realistic, but which we hope will tell us something useful about the real-world process. So here's what we do. So we take our time-variant contagion spreading rate parameter beta. What we've done is we simply anchor it at a particular point in time for convenience. We also translate it so that it's never negative. It's hard to know what a negative spreading rate parameter would mean. Arguably, I think it might break the second law of thermodynamics. So for that reason, we simply translate it so it's always positive. And we take that contagion spreading phenomenon and we implement it again using the EON Python module. Now, the EON Python module implements contagion processes per the Duke-Gillespie algorithm. We need beta to vary in time, so we iterate the Duke-Gillespie algorithm recursively. And so we're getting somewhere. So now we have a nice log periodically variant spreading rate parameter. So now what we want to do is we want to take that and propagate it on our toroidal grid lattices. So now we've left out, however, what may be influencing the power law expansion. And so for that, we choose to grow our lattices exponentially in time. And by setting that maximum graph size at a particular level, we can define the critical time to feed that back into what our contagion process modeling is doing. So now we're getting somewhere. So we have a contagion prevalence time series that's informed both by a log periodic time variant spreading rate parameter and also a kind of an ersatz power law growth, which we've implemented with exponential expansion in the underlying toroidal grid lattice. And the really interesting thing happens when we begin to count the transitions from the susceptible to the infected state. So when we do that, we notice that we begin to see a time series of simulated transmission events, which look a lot like the data that we collected for Sudan. Now, obviously, what we've done is to affect a model which we know is not realistic. And so what we want to now do is go back to directly manipulating the underlying substrate network graph. And to do that, we're looking to use hyperbolic random graphs, which were developed back in 2009 by Kryakov, Papadopoulos, Vahat, and Bukunya. Hyperbolic random graphs for HRGs have been observed to be a special case of geometric inhomogeneous random graphs. GIRGs, in particular HRG generator algorithms, produce graph objects that resemble complex real-world networks. And interestingly, a recent review paper by Titania Sharpie has indicated that there's good argument for the presence of hyperbolic geometry in neural circuits. This brings me to the close of my presentation. I'm happy to take your comments and questions by email.